He didn't come to therapy because people betrayed him. Not really. There wasn't one big story. No dramatic moment where everything fell apart. No clear villain. He came because something felt off. Because even when things were going well, he couldn't relax. Because even when people showed up for him, a quiet voice in the background kept asking questions. What if this doesn't last? What if they're just pretending? What if I get comfortable and then it changes? It wasn't loud. It didn't panic him. It just stayed there, constant, steady, uninvited. He didn't walk into relationships expecting pain in an obvious way. He laughed. He talked. He connected. From the outside, everything looked normal, but inside, there was always a slight distance, like he was present, but not fully there. Like part of him was always watching, measuring, waiting for something to shift, waiting for something to go wrong. And the strange part, nothing had to go wrong. That feeling existed even in calm moments, even with kind people, even when there was no real reason to doubt. He didn't avoid relationships. He didn't push people away, but he never fully stepped in either. There was always a line, invisible, but very real. A point where he stopped himself, where he held something back, not because he wanted to, but because something inside him didn't feel safe enough to go further. And the hardest part, he couldn't explain it. He just knew one thing for sure. Trust didn't feel like comfort. It felt like a risk. Part 1. Close to people, but never too close. 1:20 to 4:40. Alex was 38, confident in social settings, easy to talk to. The kind of person people naturally felt comfortable around. He knew how to listen. He knew how to respond. He knew how to keep a conversation flowing. Nothing about him suggested distance. In fact, most people would describe him as open, friendly, engaging, and in many ways, he was. He had relationships, he had friendships, he had people he could call, he showed up, he made time, he stayed connected. So on the surface, there was no problem. No obvious isolation, no clear sign that something was missing. But when you looked closer, there was a pattern, subtle but consistent. Every connection he had seemed to stop at a certain depth. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just gradually. Like a door that never fully opened. He shared stories. He talked about his life. He laughed about past experiences. But when it came to the parts that felt more personal, the parts that carried emotion, uncertainty, or vulnerability, he paused, not always consciously. Sometimes he would change the subject, sometimes he would joke, sometimes he would keep things light, and sometimes he would simply say nothing at all. Not because he didn't trust the person, at least not in a clear, logical way, but because something inside him hesitated. A quiet resistance, a feeling that said, maybe don't go there. And over time, that hesitation became a limit. A boundary he didn't fully choose, but still followed. People felt close to him, but they didn't always know him. Not completely, not deeply. And the strange thing was, he didn't feel completely known either. Even in long-term relationships, even with people who cared about him, there was always a small gap, a space between what he shared and what he kept to himself. And he didn't always notice it, because it felt normal. It had always been this way. To him, this was just how relationships worked. You connect, you talk, you spend time together, but you don't give everything. You don't go all the way in. You keep a part of yourself, just in case. And that, just in case, was never clearly defined. It wasn't about a specific fear. It was more like a quiet assumption that something, at some point, could change. Those people, no matter how kind, no matter how consistent, were not entirely predictable. And if that was true, then holding something back felt like the safest option. Not a strategy, not a decision, just a habit, a way of being, a way of staying connected without ever feeling completely exposed. Now, but here's the part he hadn't fully seen yet. That same habit that kept him safe was also the reason he never felt fully close to anyone. And the question slowly started forming. If you never go all the way in, can you ever truly feel what connection is supposed to be? I asked him a simple question, nothing complex, nothing heavy, just something direct. What does trusting someone feel like to you? He didn't answer right away. Not because he didn't understand the question, but the answer wasn't obvious to him. Most people respond quickly. They say things like comfort, safety, closeness, something warm, something steady. But Alex paused. He thought about it longer than expected, and when he finally answered, he didn't say any of those things. He said, exposure. That word changed everything, because it revealed something deeper than behavior. It showed how his mind interpreted trust itself. For him, trust wasn't something you relaxed into. It wasn't a safe space. It wasn't a place where you could let your guard down. It was the opposite. It was a moment where you became visible, where parts of you were no longer protected, where something valuable could be seen and possibly taken away. That's how it felt. Not as an idea, as a physical experience, a subtle tension in the body, a slight tightening, a quiet alertness, like standing somewhere without cover, not in immediate danger, but not fully safe either. And because of that, trust didn't happen naturally. It required effort. Not the effort of connecting, but the effort of allowing that exposure. And every time that moment appeared, his system reacted the same way. It slowed down. It held back. It questioned. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to interrupt the process, just enough to stop things from going too far. And the important part is this. He didn't see this as fear. He saw it as awareness, being careful, as being realistic, because in his mind, trust wasn't neutral. It carried risk, not guaranteed pain, but the possibility of it. And that possibility was enough to stay slightly guarded, enough to avoid full openness, enough to keep a part of himself out of reach, even when the other person had done nothing wrong, even when there were no signs of danger, even when everything objectively was fine, because his response wasn't based on what was happening. It was based on what could happen, on patterns he had learned earlier, on experiences that didn't need to be extreme, just repeated. Moments where things felt okay until they weren't. Moments where connection existed but didn't stay consistent. Moments where trust was given and then quietly broken. Not always in big ways, sometimes in small ones. Promises that weren't kept, attention that came and went, support that wasn't always there when needed. Nothing dramatic, but enough to teach something important. That openness doesn't always lead to safety. Sometimes it leads to disappointment. And once that idea settles in, it doesn't disappear. It becomes a filter, a lens through which every new relationship is seen. So even when the present is different, the response stays the same. Because the system isn't asking, is this person safe right now? It's asking, all right, what are the chances this could go wrong? And when that question is always active, trust never feels like a simple choice. It feels like a calculated risk, something to approach carefully, something to manage, something to limit. and without realizing it. He wasn't just protecting himself from being hurt, he was also limiting how much connection he allowed himself to feel. Because real trust requires something very specific. It requires the willingness to be open without controlling the outcome. And for him, that felt like too much. Not impossible, just unfamiliar, uncertain, and slightly unsafe. So instead of fully trusting, he stayed in a space that felt more manageable, close enough to connect, but not close enough to be fully exposed. And the question that slowly started to emerge was this: if trust feels like risk, how do you ever allow yourself to experience it completely? Part 3. The constant scanning for signs. 8:10 to 11:40. Because of that internal feeling, he developed a habit, not something obvious, not something anyone around him would easily notice, but something that quietly shaped every interaction he had. He scanned. Not in an anxious, panicked way. Not in a way that looked like overthinking. It was much more subtle than that. Almost automatic. Like a background process that never really turned off. Whenever he talked to someone, whenever he texted, whenever he spent time with people he cared about, a part of his attention was always on observing, watching for small changes, tiny details, things most people would ignore, a slight shift in tone, a message that took a little longer than usual, a response that felt just a bit different, nothing dramatic, nothing clearly negative, just different. And those small differences mattered to him, not because they meant something for sure, but because they could mean something, and that could was enough to activate his attention. He didn't jump to conclusions right away. He didn't accuse. He didn't react outwardly. From the outside, he stayed calm, normal, present, but internally, something started moving. A quiet analysis, a series of questions forms in the background. Was that different? Did I imagine that? Or is something changing? And instead of letting the moment pass, his mind held on to it, not tightly, just enough to keep it active, just enough to revisit it later. And when multiple small things appeared, they started to connect, not as proof, but as patterns. And once something feels like a pattern, it becomes harder to ignore. So even in stable relationships, even when nothing serious was happening, he was never fully relaxed. Because a part of him was always checking, always comparing, always trying to detect early signs, not of something happening, but of something potentially changing. And this is where it gets important, because this habit didn't come from nowhere. It came from learning that change can happen quietly, without warning, without clear signals. So instead of waiting for something obvious, his system adapted. It started looking earlier, looking closer, trying to catch things before they fully appeared. And in a way, it worked. It gave him a sense of control, a sense of awareness, and a feeling that he wouldn't be completely caught off guard, but there was a cost. Because when you're always scanning, you're never fully present. Part of your attention is always somewhere else. In observation, in evaluation, in quiet anticipation. And that creates a certain distance, not visible, not obvious, but real. Because connection requires something very simple: the ability to stay in the moment without constantly analyzing it. And for him, that wasn't easy. Even in good moments, even when things felt warm and stable, there was always a slight tension underneath, a readiness, like he couldn't fully lean into the experience, because a part of him was still watching it, still measuring it, still asking, is this going to stay like this? And over time, that question becomes more than just a thought. It becomes a state, a way of being in relationships, where nothing is ever fully certain, where everything feels just a little bit temporary. And when that's the case, relaxing doesn't come naturally, trust doesn't settle easily, and closeness always has a quiet limit. Not because something is wrong, but because something is always being checked. And the deeper question slowly begins to form. If you're always looking for signs that something might change, can you ever truly feel like anything is stable? Part 4. A past where trust was not consistent. 1140 to 1540. When we started talking about his past, he didn't describe anything extreme. No major trauma, no single moment that clearly explained everything. Nothing stood out in an obvious way. And that's what made it harder to understand at first. Because usually, when patterns like this appear, people expect a clear cause, something big, something undeniable. But in his case, it wasn't about intensity. It was about consistency, or more precisely, the lack of it. He talked about growing up in an environment where things were unpredictable, not chaotic, not unsafe in a visible way, just inconsistent. The people he relied on were there, but not always in the same way. Sometimes they were present, available, attentive, and other times they weren't. Not because they didn't care, but because their attention, their mood, their availability changed. And those changes weren't always explained, they just happened. One day things felt stable. The next day something felt different. Distance, distraction, silence. And as a child, he didn't question it logically. He adapted to it emotionally. He learned to notice the shifts, to feel the difference between presence and absence, between connection and disconnection, even when it was subtle, even when nothing was said out loud. And over time, that awareness became sharper, more precise, because it had to. Because understanding those changes meant staying prepared, meant not to be surprised, meant adjusting before things fully shifted. And here's the important part. It wasn't about being hurt in one big moment. It was about experiencing small inconsistencies over and over again. Promises that were made, but not always followed through. Attention that felt strong, but didn't always last. Moments of closeness that were sometimes interrupted without warning. Nothing dramatic, but enough to create a pattern. And a quiet understanding that formed over time. That connection exists, but it's not always stable. That people can be there and then not be there in the same way. That things can feel safe and then subtly change. And as a child, he couldn't control any of that. So his system did something else. It adapted. It became more aware, more observant, more sensitive to changes. Not out of fear, but out of necessity. Because when something is inconsistent, you learn to pay attention. You learn to read between the lines. You learn to notice what's not being said. And most importantly, you learn not to fully rely on stability. Not completely. Because you've seen that it can shift, that it can disappear quietly, without a clear reason, without a clear warning. So instead of fully relaxing into connection, you stay slightly prepared, slightly aware, slightly guarded. And that way of responding doesn't stay in childhood. It carries forward into adulthood, into new relationships, into situations that are completely different, but feel familiar at a deeper level. Because the system isn't comparing facts. It's comparing patterns, and when it recognizes something similar, it reacts the same way, even if the context has changed, even if the people are different, even if objectively things are more stable now. That early experience created a kind of expectation, not a conscious belief, but a quiet assumption. Those things don't always stay the same. That closeness can shift. That consistency isn't guaranteed. And once that assumption exists, it influences everything. How you connect. How do you open up? How much do you trust? Not in obvious ways, but in small, consistent ones. Like holding something back, like staying slightly alert, like never fully settling into the moment, and the deeper realization begins to emerge. If you grew up learning that connection can change without warning, how do you ever fully believe that it can stay? As an adult, his life looked different, more stable, more predictable. The people around him were not the same. The environment had changed. There were no obvious reasons to stay guarded, no clear signs that something was about to go wrong. And yet, his system didn't respond to that difference, because it wasn't reacting to the present, it was reacting to probability, not what was happening right now, but what could happen next. That's the part most people don't immediately see, because from the outside, and everything seems fine. The relationship is steady, the communication is clear, there are no major issues, but internally, the experience is completely different, because his nervous system isn't asking, is everything okay right now? It's asking, how likely is it that this might change? And when that question is always active, relaxation becomes difficult, not impossible, but incomplete. There's always a small part that stays alert, that stays ready, just in case, and that, just in case, shapes everything. It shapes how much he shares, how deeply he connects, how long does he stay in moments of vulnerability, because every time he starts to open up, that internal system steps in, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to interrupt, just enough to slow things down, to create a slight pause, a hesitation. And in that pause, a decision is made, not consciously, but automatically, to hold something back, to not go all the way, to keep a part of himself protected. And this is where trust becomes complicated, because trust requires something very specific. It requires the ability to stay open without controlling the outcome, to allow connection without needing guarantees, to be present without constantly preparing for change. But his system had learned something different. It had learned that openness without control can lead to disappointment, not always, but enough times to matter, enough times to leave an impression. So instead of fully letting go, it found a middle ground, a place that felt safer, a place where connection was possible, but exposure was limited, where closeness existed, but only up to a certain point, where he could engage without fully risking himself. And in many ways, this worked. It allowed him to have relationships, to function, to connect, to live a normal life on the surface. But underneath, there was always something missing, a depth that never fully developed, a sense of closeness that never completely settled. Because real connection requires a level of openness that his system wasn't fully allowing. And the reason is simple. Not easy, but simple. His system wasn't designed to maximize connection. It was designed to minimize pain, to reduce the chances of being caught off guard, to stay prepared for change. Even when change wasn't happening, even when everything was stable. And that creates a quiet tension, because part of him wants closeness, wants to feel fully connected, wants to relax into relationships. But another part, he is still protecting him, still remembering patterns from the past, still saying, stay aware, stay careful, don't give everything. And those two parts don't fully agree. So instead of choosing one or the other, he stays in between, not completely closed, not completely open, just enough of both to function, but not enough to fully experience what connection can be. And that leads to an important question. If your system is always trying to protect you from what might happen, how do you ever allow yourself to fully experience what is happening? Part 6. The moment he understood his own distance, 1840 to 2040, the turning point didn't come from a big event. Nothing dramatic happened, no argument, no breakup, no sudden realization in the middle of a crisis. It came quietly, almost unnoticed at first, during a simple reflection, a normal conversation, the kind that doesn't seem important in the moment, but stays with you later. I asked him something directly, not complicated, just honest. Are people not trustworthy, or are you never giving them the chance to be? At first, he didn't react, not because the question didn't matter, but because it didn't make sense right away. His mind went to the obvious answer. Of course, people can't always be trusted. He had seen enough to know that. He had experienced inconsistency, uncertainty, moments where things changed without warning. So the idea felt clear, logical, but something about the question stayed with him. It didn't go away. It followed him after the session ended. Later that day, then the next. It kept repeating in the background, not loudly, just enough to keep his attention. And slowly, he started looking at his own behavior, not in a critical way, just observing, watching how he interacted, how he responded in small moments, how he showed up in relationships. And that's when he noticed something subtle, something he hadn't fully seen before. He wasn't being heard, not currently. There was no active betrayal, no clear sign that people were failing him, but at the same time, he wasn't fully allowing them in either. There was always a limit, a point where he stopped, a moment where he held something back, not because something went wrong, but because something might go wrong. And that realization shifted everything, because it changed the focus from what others were doing to what he was preventing. He started seeing the pattern more clearly. In conversations, he would stay on safe topics. When things became more personal, he would redirect. When vulnerability appeared, he would soften it, not completely avoid it, but reduce it, control it, and the result was always the same. He stayed connected, but never fully exposed, never fully open, and because of that, he never truly experienced what would happen if he didn't hold back, if he stayed present a little longer, if he shared a little more, if he didn't interrupt the moment with caution. He realized something important. He wasn't just protecting himself.